We return to the climax of our story as we come to this final week that we're spending in the book of Esther. In a strange twist of fate, Haman has just been humiliated as Mordecai has been honored. Esther, the young Jewish woman who has hidden her identity as a Jew for 6 years in the palace, has run out of time. She has promised the king to make her request at this final banquet. She has one chance to convince the king not to commit genocide, to annihilate all of her people as Haman has plotted. In order to convince the king, she is going to have to risk admitting that she has hidden her identity from her husband for all of these years. For a second night in a row, Esther dines alone with 2 violent men who have plotted the death of her entire people. Her husband, King Xerxes, and his right-hand man, Haman. There are some attendants serving the feast. Esther draws on every ounce of political savvy that she has gained in 6 years in the palace. She uses everything she knows about her husband to set up her request with the best possible chance for success. As she courageously moves forward with a plan that still puts her at great risk for the hope of saving her family and all of her people. Once again, Esther makes sure that the wine is flowing to get Xerxes into good spirits, and as they are drinking, the queen waits with bated breath for the moment that will inevitably come. She doesn't come right out and ask Xerxes for what she wants. She waits until he brings it up again. And so again, he makes a brazen promise to his wife. What is your petition, Queen Esther? It will be granted to you. What is your request, even up to half of my kingdom? It will be fulfilled. It is a bold promise, one that likely gives Esther some hope of success, especially since it has now been promised 3 times to her by the king. But she continues to play her political game. She doesn't come right out and say, I wish that you and your advisor here would grow up and stop acting like genocidal maniacs. Instead, she plays to the king's ego. Instead of pointing out that his law that he has passed is cruel and unjust, Esther, knowing that the king is swayed more by his pride than by justice, presents the scheme as an insult and affront to King Xerxes, instead of to the humanity of all of the people that he and Haman have planned to kill. So she cleverly says, if I have won your favor, O king, if it pleases the king, let my life be given to me. That is my petition. Let me and my people live. That is the only request I make of you. For I and all of my people have been sold to be slaughtered and annihilated. If I were only to be enslaved with them, I would not bother you with such a trivial matter. But I cannot stay silent knowing that this wound is about to come to you, my king. The enemy who plotted this will surely never be able to compensate you for this loss. Xerxes plays right into Esther's hand. He says, who is he? Where is the fiend who presumed to do this? A great enemy indeed, this wicked Haman. And Haman, who hours before had been proud and boasting of how important he was to get to dine with the king and queen when there were no other guests, is no longer so happy in his position at this table. He becomes truly terrified. Xerxes' immediate reaction to this information from Esther is to storm off into the gardens, leaving Esther alone at the table with a genocidal man who is planning to kill her entire family, with a few attendants nearby. Now Haman absolutely terrified, does the one thing that he sees he has left to do. He throws himself at the mercy of Queen Esther. He sees that the king is enraged. He knows that Xerxes is not a merciful man. He has some hope for the queen. So he throws himself onto the couch that Esther is reclining on to beg her for his life to be spared. And the king walks back in, assumes that Haman is attempting to assault the queen, and at the height of Xerxes' rage, one of the eunuchs decides to speak up. His name is Harbona. He was mentioned briefly in the first chapter of this book. He was also in attendance when Vashti was deposed. He didn't speak up then, but now, for whatever reason, he seizes his moment. He brings information that he has noticed that the king has not, in a critical moment, the most impactful moment to share. Look, King Xerxes, the very execution pole that Haman has built to kill Mordecai, that man who saved your life, stands outside Haman's own house now. It is the opportune moment, and Xerxes is enraged further. Hearing this, he orders that Haman be executed on the same pole he intended for the murder of Mordecai. The king, ever continuing with lavish gifts and promises, gives Haman's estate to Esther. And Esther finally tells her husband who her people are, who her adopted father is. And so this time, as Mordecai waits at the king's gate for news, he receives a different kind of messenger. Because for 6 years he has waited outside to hear news of his daughter, only passed through messages, unable to reach her in person. But now, knowing their relationship, Mordecai is finally invited inside to see his daughter after 6 years of waiting and working to better her odds in this world. If any question remained in his mind about the results of Esther's plan, they are quickly laid to rest as he is brought before the king and queen, because King Xerxes gives him his signet ring to take the political position that Haman has just left vacant. And Queen Esther awards him with Haman's entire estate, which was just gifted to her. Now Esther and Mordecai seem poised for their happily ever after ending, with riches and fame and safety. But there is one thing left in this sordid affair, because there is still a decree out there that Xerxes had sent out that all Jews must be slaughtered. And so again, Esther brings a plea before the king, dropping to her knees, bringing up Haman's plot against the Jews. She asks the king to do the wise thing, to revoke his order to take back an unjust ruling. And the king, who just promised her half of his kingdom if she asked for it, tells her that no edict written in his name and bearing his seal can ever be revoked. It's a frankly ridiculous law that doesn't allow for reform or correction when injustice occurs. Xerxes has a solution. He hands Esther a pen and ink and says, "Write any decree you want. I will send it out in my name. I will put my seal on it. Anything that you want said." Even after all of this mess, Xerxes has not learned to properly consider his actions or take responsibility for his own authority. At least in this case, he hands the reins to decent and wise people. Esther, as always, consults Mordecai, and they gather the king's secretaries to draft out a decree and translate it into every language of the land. a decree that declares that the Jews ought to prepare to defend themselves from any attacks, and that they are allowed to stop any who would destroy them. It's a bit of a ridiculous situation that Esther and Mordecai must put out this decree instead of being able to retract the original one that caused so much confusion and despair. But it is the best they can come up with in a land where the king refuses to take anything back. Mordecai is raised to Haman's position of honor, and all of the Jews in the land celebrate. I'm sure all of the ones who fasted and prayed with Mordecai now offer prayers of thanks as they shout with joy that they have a chance to survive. The Jews hold a great feast to celebrate, to mark their gratitude, and many people throughout the land start claiming to be Jews now, rather than trying to figure out what to do with these two contradictory edicts. The day comes that Haman selected by casting lots, the 13th day of Adar. The Jewish people gather and prepare to defend themselves against any who would try to carry out Haman's plot against them. Fear has taken over many of those who would have slaughtered them before. All of the governors and princes, seeing Mordecai now in power, have thrown their support to the Jews rather than those who would attack them. But still, there are some who want to carry out Haman's plan. Some who still hate the Jewish people enough to try to destroy them, including Haman's 10 sons. But they do not stand a chance against the power that the Jews now wield. While many who have stood against them have chosen not to now that the new edict has gone out, across Persia, chapter 9 tells us that the Jewish people killed 75,000 of the people who hated them and still attempted this attack. This text is a story of victory and deliverance, don't get me wrong, but I have to take a moment to recognize how completely unnecessary this violence was. 75,000 people die in this story because they let hatred for their neighbors fester, and because the king allowed Haman to stir these people's wrath and hatred against the Jews. He emboldened them with a royal decree that said that they could kill and plunder any Jews that they wanted to, continuing to allow hatred and fear of those different from them to fester and grow. And instead of having the humility to admit publicly that he was wrong in listening to Haman's fear-mongering, instead of admitting that he had behaved unjustly, Xerxes leaves Esther and Mordecai to clean up his mess and figure out how to protect their people with the genocidal edict still intact and standing as law. And so 75,000 people refuse to back down from their most hateful and violent urges, and they march towards their deaths for the sake of their hatred. This story ends with great celebration and feasting for the Jewish people as it tells of how Mordecai continued to gain power and use it to protect all of his people, to improve the lot of the Jewish people in Persia. But even this ending that is filled with feasting, celebration, and gratitude for God's deliverance occurs with the shadow of extreme violence. It's hard to find peaceful solutions when war and death are of no consequence to rulers who care only for the lives of those in their personal orbit. Xerxes did not allow for the Jewish people to be saved because he came to understand that bigotry, violence, and genocide are wrong. He didn't have a great repentance and change of heart. He saved them because he found out that two people who mattered to him, his queen and his father-in-law who saved his life, were at risk under this decree. Esther and Mordecai were able to use the king's pride and his temper to spare their people from annihilation, and that is a remarkable divine deliverance from a powerful empire under the rule of a violent man. But Xerxes has not come to recognize the inherent value of human life, and his flippancy towards violence continues to impact the way the story unfolds, with 75,000 people dying for it. Still, even as they continue to live in an empire that is ruled by an incredibly foolish and violent man, Esther and Mordecai have much to be grateful for. Because it is clear that while God has been silent in their story, they have never been abandoned or alone, even in this violent world under the power of a tyrant. God has been at work throughout the 9 years that this story covers to bring Esther and Mordecai into positions where they might work for the good of their people, even under an unjust ruler. And when given these opportunities, Esther and Mordecai behaved with courage and sometimes cunning to save their people from certain death. And even when that major threat has subsided, when the impending doom is no longer a threat to their people, they continue to use what authority they do have for the benefit of others, to make their world a little more just, a little more safe for people who have been at risk in this empire. They see that God brought them to positions of influence, and they rightly recognize that that brings them a continuing responsibility to bear that authority and influence well. May we be so wise and courageous in using our own influence and authority wherever we find it in this broken world. If you would like to join us on our quest to follow God through whatever happens in this world, or to ask for the prayer of God's people, which we know is a powerful thing, I invite you to come forward as we sing.